First of all, welcome to Canberra. I haven't had a chance to meet all of you yet. I hope to do so definitely before lunch. My name's Raymond. I'm one of the conveners of this conference with my colleague Debbie Chan. I'd just like to begin by welcoming you to country. We have a tradition here in Australia of acknowledging the traditional owners of the country. So I'd like to acknowledge, celebrate and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and to all First Nations Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and work and whose cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in Australia. And I'd like to pay my respects to their leaders, past, present and emerging. I'm going to give some admin notes before I hand over to our guest speaker and presiding officer, Professor Graeme Smith, to open this event. But first of all, can I just say thank you for kindly travelling so far to this conference. I know for some of you it's just a walk across campus, but I know from many of you it's a trip halfway across the globe, and we really appreciate you being here for what I think is quite a special event. I don't think we've seen a conference focused on this particular topic, a very important topic of Chinese companies operating abroad. So thank you for that. So that's it from me. Now I'd like to hand over to my good friend and colleague, Professor Graeme Smith, who's probably known to many of you. He's a leading scholar in terms of China's relations and growing footprint in the Pacific region. He's a leader on many fronts. He has a podcast which I encourage many of you to access, the Little Red China podcast, and he's also recently taken over editing for the China Story blog. So I'd like to hand over to Graeme now to open this conference. And I look forward to the discussions over the next 2 days. Thanks, Graeme.
Well, welcome to Breaking Boundaries. How good is China's weather? To borrow a favourite phrase of a former Prime Minister of ours, whenever he was describing something that wasn't very good, he would pose it as a question and say, how good is? So how good is China's weather? Welcome to Canberra. Those of you who've come from, I know at least one of you has come from Hawaii. I hope you're surviving. If not, I don't know, Greg, do we have any provision for fleeces and things like that if people are underprepared?
We think the room's going to warm up quite nice.
The room, actually, you've pressed the button, so that's good. Yeah, no, if you forget to press the button, things get very tricky in this room. Absolutely wonderful to see you all here. Huge congratulations to Greg and Debbie for bringing this all together. This has been some time in the making, as you would all know. And really for me it's very exciting to see it realised with such a diversity of scholars, the prospect of us looking at so many different parts of the elephant, people from different backgrounds from all over the world, and covering areas that, to be honest, I haven't really read much about in terms of China's engagement before. Particularly excited that there are so many Indonesia experts in the room, selfishly because I'm always being asked, yeah, Pacific, sure, but what about Indonesia? And I just scratch my head and go, you know, all the Indonesians are Sino, just look at Indonesia, not China. So absolutely fantastic to see that in the program. In terms of origin stories, in order to sort of, I think, set a theme for what we're going to see throughout this conference, history is often accident. This building itself is an accident. You shouldn't be in this building. It was never meant to exist. The original director of China in the world was a guy called Jeremy Barmay, who I'm sure you all know by reputation, if not personally. And he came up with this idea in cahoots with Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister at the time. And Kevin loved the idea. Jeremy obviously loved the idea. It was his baby. But the Prime Minister's, the PM&C secretary, a guy by the name of Moran, did not love the idea. And he thought the best way to kill it was to make the price tag for the project so large that Kevin would have to say no. And so he added on a building, which added $20 million to the price. to make it an eye-watering 60 million plus. And rather than being deterred, Kevin was even more excited, imagining himself opening said building. And so here we are in a building that was never, ever meant to be. I was there when Jeremy got the phone call telling him that he'd got a building. It was quite funny. But anyway, history is accident. And this is, I think, one thing common to a lot of our research is we often get asked, look, why are you interested in these companies? Why are you interested in following the money? Surely it's China. These companies just do what the party state tells them to do, right? And it's really great to see geoeconomics taking its place alongside geopolitics, rather than just being focused on submarines, to focus on the people with skin in the game, the people who run these companies and what sort of experiences they have in country. This doesn't just apply outside of China, it also applies inside China. Anita Chan is in the room and she knows this better than myself. You have formal government structures, but often, even in Anhui, which, my part of Anhui was really a very strong, almost predatory state, but even there, the driving force was companies. Sure, those companies were often run by relatives and friends of the politicians, but they were the ones who woke up in the morning and had to get stuff done because they had real skin in the game. They weren't just going to spend their days 吃喝嫖赌, as was often the phrase, eating, drinking, and the other two I don't need to translate. But essentially, this focus on companies applies within China, but outside of China, it becomes extremely apparent. So in the Pacific, when I first started doing this research, you'd go to the embassies and you'd struggle to find anyone. Like you'd literally, really be struggling to find anyone to not just take your calls, but just, it's like these enormous buildings with no one in them. In contrast, when you went to see the companies, you would meet people who were not overstaffed, but their days were full. There was no question that they were looking for projects and they were spending every waking moment working the local government, working the multilaterals, working even the metropolitan donors to get projects happening, to 跑项目, to borrow the great Chinese phrase. So it's so interesting to be faced with 2 days of this. I'm aware I need to keep to schedule. So it's really wonderful to just look through the program and look at the diversity of case studies that we're faced with in this. And to sort of challenge, I think, looking at many of the things, the idea that these big names, such as state-owned enterprise, the idea that all SOEs are the same. I think in a lot of your research, we're going to hear that corporate histories matter. The personal history of the project manager on the ground matters. The experience of the company in country, its ability to adapt to local conditions, for better or for worse, really matters in terms of these companies' behaviours. Selfishly, obviously, I'll be looking out for talent for the Little Red podcast and for the China story. If I'm not in the room, because I've got a few things on, that won't get you out of it. I've got spies who will be listening out for talent. But welcome all, and very, very keen to hear what you all have to say. And yeah, look forward to hearing so much more from you in the future. Just wonderful to see the future of this discipline in the room before me. So thanks very much and have a great conference.
So, I guess we're ready to start. So my name's Colin Hawes. I'm just chairing this first panel, and I'm from the University of Technology, Sydney, and really looking forward to hearing these speakers and the whole conference. So we're going to start with Sanoop Koshy from Indian Institute of Technology in Madras. And Sanoop is a PhD scholar in international relations with a focus on China studies, also South Asia, foreign policy and diplomacy. So as Greg mentioned, I'll be timing, and if we could try to keep it to 15 minutes, and I'll be passing some rude notes over to remind you. But for now, let's pass it over to Sanoop, and his presentation is Political and Strategic Influence of Chinese State-Owned Enterprises in South Asia. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Collins. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sanoop, and already said I am from India. I am doing my PhD there. And thank you for having me here. I thank Dr. Greg and Debbie for organizing this thing. And I'm so happy and anxious at the same time being the first presenter in this conference. Am I audible? Hello. Okay. Okay, since as I have very limited time, maybe I have to skip some of the slides too. I have 13 slides. If I take 1 minute each, itself it will be taking my all time. So let me move on. So the main objective of my presentation today is to examine the motivations, patterns, strategies, and impact of Chinese state-owned enterprises in South Asia through various case studies of BRI. And I will be focusing specifically on these three countries and some case studies, selected case studies in these countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. So these are the current Chinese investments on part of BRI in these three countries. And so let me begin. The state-owned enterprises and the Belt and Road Initiative in South Asia. The state-owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, SASAC, of the States Council of China is responsible for managing the state-owned enterprises. And the SASAC directly oversees the investor responsibilities of 110 non-financial central SOEs. So many scholars have recognized that Belt and Road Initiative as a geostrategic tool employed by China to reorient the international system and align with its holistic foreign policy. Instead of promoting open market access to its loans and grants, China employs an aid infrastructure where the funds provided by them are embedded in contracts with well-connected Chinese state-owned enterprises. Notably, this approach can be observed in BRI projects in South Asia, such as those in Pakistan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, etc. Only India is not part of these BRI projects currently. In these instances, contracts for projects financed by Chinese grants were not subject to open bidding. Chinese state-owned companies directly received the project contracts from the Chinese government, leading to the production of goods and services by these companies within the recipient countries. Now coming to the role of the state-owned enterprises, they have long played a significant role in China's economic development. According to a Dragonomics research report, the SOE sector accounted for approximately 30% of China's GDP as of 2015. Furthermore, a large majority, ranging from 70% to 80% of these SOEs operate within the infrastructure investment sector. Now, China's strategy with the BRI involves encouraging member states to align their future development strategies around BRI infrastructure projects. This approach indirectly increases and likelihood of this project implementation while reducing the chances of member states abandoning these projects in the future. Now coming to the impact on South Asian countries, countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh I am discussing today have provided local leadership with economic wins. In return of these investments, these countries have aligned with China on various issues, including border conflicts, treatment of minority groups, and responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. For China, the BRI not only offers market access and long-term holdings, but also provides strategic geographical advantages, particularly in its rivalry with India. China's influence in South Asia through projects like China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and investments in Sri Lanka can potentially render regional organizations like the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation or SARC to be irrelevant. And coming to the case studies, I have chosen the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in Pakistan, also the Gwadar Port Development Project, which is also part of this economic corridor, but it's very relevant in these countries. So the SOEs involved are China Communication Construction Company, China Railway Construction Company, State Grid Corporation of China, China Mobile Corporation, and China Overseas Port Holding Company. So these companies have invested in the telecommunication, power infrastructure, railway projects, infrastructure projects, etc. So they are seen with many political and strategic influence, including the strategic connectivity I mentioned. These projects facilitates enhance connectivity between China and Pakistan, supporting regional trade and economic integration. They also contribute to China's broader strategic objectives of establishing secure and efficient trade routes, particularly through the development of the Gwadar port I mentioned. Now, the close investment of Chinese SOEs in Pakistan's major infrastructure projects strengthens bilateral relations between the two countries. It fosters a sense of economic interdependence and cooperation, promoting mutual political interests and strategic alignments. The geopolitical considerations I am mentioning here is that China's investment in Pakistan through SOEs are driven by geopolitical factors also, including the desire to establish a stronger presence in the Indian Ocean region and counterbalance the influence of other regional powers. These projects enhance China's access to strategic sea lines and contribute to its broader geopolitical goals. Now, in the case of Sri Lanka, I've taken the cases of Colombo Port City project and the Hambantota Port Development project, which are done by China Communication Construction Company and China Harbour Engineering Company. And for the Hambantota, it is a China Merchant Ports Company, Port Holdings Company Limited, or CM Port. So this Colombo Port City project aims to create a modern metropolis on reclaimed land near the Colombo port. And the project has attracted significant Chinese investments and is expected to enhance Sri Lanka's economic growth and connectivity. However, it has also raised questions about land ownership, environmental impacts, and potential geopolitical implications. The project aims to transform Colombo into a major financial and commercial hub in South Asia. It enhances Sri Lanka's connectivity and economic prospects while strengthening China's presence in the region. The economic influence include the Colombo Port City project is expected to attract significant foreign direct investments or FDI and promote economic growth in Sri Lanka. It will create job opportunities, stimulate the real estate sector, and enhance the country's position as a regional hub for trade and finance. Since also these projects are also not without controversies, many concerns have been raised about the potential environmental impact, coastal ecosystem due to impact on coastal ecosystem due to land reclamation. There are also debates regarding the long-term economic viability and potential debt burden for Sri Lanka. And this is my last case study on Bangladesh. I have taken the Padma Bridge project and the Paira coal-fired power plant project. These are done by the China Major Bridge Engineering Company and the China National Machinery Import and Export Corporation and China Energy and Engineering Corporation. So this is also involved in these SOEs are involved in the construction of infrastructure like bridge and power plants. As I said, it enhances Bangladesh's connectivity and trade links, promoting economic growth. The construction of Padma Bridge creates employment opportunities and stimulates economic growth in Bangladesh. It improves transportation infrastructure, enhances connectivity between regions, and reduces travel time and logistics costs, thereby boosting their trade and investment. This is also part of many controversies and concerns. The project faced allegations of corruption and mismanagement during the procurement process, leading to delays and concerns over transparency. Measures were taken to address these issues, including investigation and changes in the management structure. Now, I'm moving forward to the analysis from these projects. I have sorted out three phases I have collected. It is the motivations, strategies, and impact on and behind these projects by Chinese SOEs. Coming to motivations, the Chinese SOE seeks to expand their economic reach and access new markets in South Asia. They aim to secure resources, establish trade routes, and promote investment opportunities for Chinese business. The BRI serves China's strategic interest by enhancing its geopolitical presence in South Asia. Chinese SOEs play a crucial role in extending China's influence and fostering political alliances in the region. And coming to the infrastructure development, it engaged in large-scale projects as part of the BRI, aiming to improve connectivity, trade facilitation, and regional integration. These projects enhance China's image as a global leader in infrastructure development. And coming to the strategies, the project development, Chinese SOEs take a proactive approach in identifying and developing infrastructure projects in South Asia. They offer financing, construction expertise, and technology transfer to host countries, often through the establishment of joint ventures or public-private partnerships. Chinese SOEs closely cooperate with host governments to align project objectives with national development plans and objectives. This collaboration ensures smooth implementation and fosters long-term partnership. And coming to the impact on economic transformation, Chinese SOEs contribute to the economic transformation of host countries through job creation, skill transfer, and increased trade opportunities. They facilitate the development of critical infrastructure such as ports, roads, and energy facilities which stimulate economic growth. And it enhances the regional connectivity through these projects, and it improves the trade flows, promoting cross-border investment and economic integration among South Asian nations. And also many debates and controversies, as I already mentioned. The impact of Chinese SOEs is not without any controversies. Concerns over debt sustainability, labor practices, environmental impacts, and lack of transparency have sparked debates about the long-term implications of Chinese investments in South Asia. And I'm concluding towards the implications and lessons from these analyses. South Asian nations have an unwavering demand for connectivity projects. So they wanted many connectivity projects. For example, Bangladesh sees itself as at the crossroad of South and Southeast Asia, while Sri Lanka and Maldives aspire to become the next Singapore or the next Dubai. To capitalize on their strategic geography, South Asian states are desperate for infrastructure like roads, highways, ports to improve connectivity both internally and externally to regional and global trading networks. When funding from Japan, India, US, or other sources is not available, countries often turn to China. This option has advantages such as large amount of available funding, often on concessional terms, and the speed with which credit is approved. And coming to the next implication I found is the pattern of vulnerabilities. These case studies, I have found that part of the challenge facing South Asian state is that rapid inflow of Chinese money and the exponential increase in the Chinese influence over the last 2 decades has come against the backdrop of 3 pronounced systemic vulnerabilities like fragile or brittle state institutions. It includes the stability of government, domestic corruption, bureaucratic capacity, and capacity of law enforcement. So I found there are weak state institutions, then weak civil societies, like free press is not there, freedom of speech and association, internet freedom, strength of civil society. So these patterns are also found. And finally, the high potential of elite capture and corruption. So these includes foreign penetration, elite corruption under foreign influence, crony capitalism under foreign influence, freedom of academic and research environment. So these patterns of vulnerabilities are found in these South Asian nations. And so the third one, proactive Chinese actors and their strategic economic assets. China's primary investment of influence in these countries are economic, though they serve longer-term Chinese strategic ends and help expand its influence in a region that has traditionally been considered as India's strategic backyard. It loans to Sri Lanka were at 4.6 billion in 2020, 4.6 billion US dollars in 2020, despite the pandemic, and the figures for Maldives is believed to be between or around 1.5 billion US dollars. China is helping to construct mega infrastructure projects in every country in the region except India, in most cases with money that it has lent them. So Chinese actors identify opportunities and make offers without waiting for the country to ask first. Chinese embassies, SOEs, private firms, journalists, and other actors present in a country. Okay, let me go on to the next one. Mutual learning and evolving agencies. So these countries, for example, Dhaka or Sri Lanka's experience with China has taught the rest of the South Asian nations that despite the benefits, the term of the loans for these projects should not be too onerous to the recipient countries. In Bangladesh, there is a recognition of the implications of reducing concessional financing and monitoring debt levels. So they are mutually learning from each other with their experiences and their understanding, and they are evolving their own policies. And finally, the debt trap, or is it the middle income track? So BRI partners are keenly aware of the risk of debt trap diplomacy, as commonly said. And 3 of the 5 South Asian nations, Bhutan, Maldives, and Sri Lanka, already have concerning level of debt. Yet these countries' debt problems go far beyond the reach of China. Maldives' debt to China is only 8.6% of its total debt, and Sri Lanka's debt to China is just 5.5%. Bhutan has also no debt to China, but still has the highest debt to GDP ratio of South Asian countries. Yet even if South Asian countries avoid a debt trap, they may still fall victim to the middle income trap. As discussed above, after reaching middle income levels, countries often see their economic growth slow and find it hard to move beyond this status. So let me conclude by moving forward. It is crucial for South Asian countries to balance their economic development aspiration with prudent debt management practices. Strengthening government frameworks, transparency, and accountability in project implementation will help mitigate risk and ensure sustainable outcomes. Additionally, South Asian countries should focus on diversifying their economic base and addressing structural issues to overcome the middle income trap. By promoting innovation, enhancing competitiveness, and investment in human capital, these countries can build resilient economies capable of withstanding external shock and achieving sustainable development. So overall, the future of Chinese SOEs in South Asia hinges on addressing these challenges, fostering mutually beneficial partnerships, and promoting inclusive and sustainable development. So these are the references, some of the references I have mentioned here. Okay, Xie, thank you. I look forward for more discussion. This is an initial stage of my research, so I look forward more discussion in the coming session. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, for not butchering my name. I do appreciate that, and thank you, Graeme, for acknowledging the huge disparity in temperature between Hawaii and Canberra. Let's see. Okay, so in 2021, I was in Suva, mostly to talk to people about China, and around about April of that year, there were just a series of COVID lockdowns. And it really put sort of my conversations, like, stopped me in my tracks. And so to stave off boredom, to keep active, try and think about how am I going to do my work during the pandemic, I just started to take long walks through Suva. And not coincidentally, most of my waypoints were Chinese construction sites. And here are some of the photographs that I took as I wandered around. On the top left there, you can see this is the construction site of the Fiji Holdings Limited Tower. This is being undertaken by the China Railway First Group. If you know Suva, this is in the Flagstaff neighborhood. The image in the middle here is the Fiji-China Friendship Pavilion, constructed by Yenjian Group. This is on Cumming Street in downtown. And in the background, you can see another construction site, which is the MHCC Tower, which is also being, that one's under construction by the China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation. And that commemorates 160 years of the first arrival, allegedly, of a Chinese in Fiji. On the right here, you've got the commemoration marker for the Stinson Parade Bridge. Again, this is in downtown Suva in Fiji. Behind is the bridge, but the monument is of interest here. This was constructed by China Railway 14. So all of these sites, these Chinese companies, are really significant spaces of contact between Fiji and China in the country. And so let's first of all take a look at what people are saying about Chinese companies in the Pacific Islands. This is, on the left here, maybe some of us know this individual, Tarsisius Kabutulaku at the University of Hawaii. This is what he says: Chinese firms are often at the forefront of Pacific Islands governments' communities' encounter with China. They usually precede the Chinese state. Furthermore, they are central to China's geo-economic, geopolitical, and geostrategic influence. Again, to underscore the importance of Chinese companies in the Pacific Islands, This is Sandra Tart at USP in Suva in Fiji. She says the current perception of the Asian powerhouse as an economic colonizer in the Pacific stems from the actions of Chinese firms rather than the government. So, okay, the Chinese companies are, they're not only mediators of Chinese state interests and influence and policies like the Belt and Road Initiative, but they are also grounded as well. And Graeme mentioned this in his opening remarks. Yeah, this idea that they interact with societies, and particularly in the Pacific Islands as well. They don't, they interact with government agencies. They interact with labor and procurement markets. They compete with each other in these construction markets. So what I'm going to look at here are the grounded logics of Chinese companies in Fiji, particularly Chinese construction companies, and I'm going to do it through the eyes of the middle manager. Yeah, these guys really step up. As they say, they're really got the skin in the game when they are interacting with Fijian societies. So, going to look at how they balance civil, corporate, and state interests. And what implications does that have for the projection of Chinese state influence in a place like Fiji? Just a quick note on some methods. This research is based on semi-structured interviews and also some structured interview questionnaires that I did between 2017 and 2021. This was with 5 Chinese construction companies in Fiji, and also supplemented this material with a critical discourse analysis of about a decade's worth of materials that have been published by companies and also media articles. Another quick note here on the companies that are under review in this paper. As you can see in this central column here, you've got these companies listed. We talked a little bit about them earlier in that first slide. You've got CCECC, a wholly state-owned enterprise. And then you have the railways, Railway First, Railway 5, and Railway 14, which are state-owned, but also stock exchange listed as well. And the NGN Group, a former state-owned enterprise now in private hands. These entities, they work in multiple countries. They have Fijian subsidiaries that are registered. But regardless of their ownership, their funding for their projects comes from many different sources. You've got ADB, multilateral sources, of course, Fijian government, Chinese state loans and grants, and also from private entities too, private capital within Fiji. And these companies will work on something like a major highway to building a volleyball court, for example. Usually they get their start in Fiji with a Chinese state loan or grant, meaning that with that money, they're able to bring equipment, they're able to bring personnel, and establish a corporate office in Suva. All right, I'm going to move on to the first of 4 different aspects of the operations of these companies and how the middle managers saw them. So when I spoke to middle managers, they did sort of repeat Chinese state developmentalist narratives that economic relations with Fiji were win-win, that this would open up markets, increase connectivity, upgrade infrastructure. And one middle manager said, our presence gives the Fijian economy wings. And that developmentalist attitude also went to the Fijian employees that they had on staff. They said, if you work hard with us, you can change your life. Many were proud as well to work on projects that were like building hospitals on the main island of Viti Levu. There were 2 hospitals built with Chinese state grants, one in Ba and then one in Navua. And they felt that this gave off an impression of China as a good global force and that themselves as good corporate citizens. But it wasn't all positive. And that first quote tells us a little bit about this kind of attitude. It says, we fear ties to the Chinese government. It does make others look at our company different, as not separate. There's negative press about Chinese influence that impacts business. We work hard to show that we are part of the community with donations to local community projects. So what I found in this sort of gauging the relationship with the state is that it was very much premised on the bottom line, whether it was useful for their operations and to getting things done. Another individual said, really sort of gave me it pretty raw and just said, it's about making money. We do fast, cheap, quality construction. We aren't directed by the Chinese government. We're directed by the company. The company is set up to make money. Going to move on to the second aspect of operations of Chinese construction companies in Fiji, and this is this idea of dealing with local agencies. Many middle managers or company representatives said to me that the agencies within the government that they dealt with and the officials were corrupt. And this was under the Bainimarama administration, so maybe things have changed, but a lot of Fijians told me that these companies must be corrupt because the only way you can do this business is to be corrupt and to get things done. So what I found, though, is that the biggest sort of bugbear was a capricious regulatory environment, that unexpected fees, surprise inspections, delayed permits were an issue, and that they were weighing up the economic costs of challenging those against the political ones of how they would come across. So they expressed this difficulty of doing business due to the vulnerability of state power and also of the economic relations. On the one hand, vulnerable to corruption, and then on the other hand, they didn't get a lot of protection from the Chinese embassy. And this quote is quite exemplary. We find the regulatory bodies at the ground level the biggest impediment to doing business. We don't get much help from the Chinese embassy when we come up against corruption. We are left to manage both governments and still make sure the project is delivered. Okay, third aspect, labor relations. This one is a lot more contentious in Fijian social and political discourse. There was a lot of pressure, just like any middle manager. You've got to meet your budget, you've got to meet your timeline, right? So a lot of the solutions were to import labor, and this caused some sort of negative perceptions out there. As one person said, we just want efficiency to get the project done. There aren't enough skilled laborers and translators. How can we hire locals? And many middle managers said to me, hey, this is just an economic decision. However, they felt pressure that it was being turned into a racial one. And usually from what they said was an external hostile media. This country, the country I just came from, the United States, were issues there. But also opposition MPs in Fiji. At that time, SODELPA MPs were making some traction from this particular issue. There's no Fijian law stipulating that Fijians should be hired, but many contracts include it. However, a lot of middle managers made no real effort to understand work culture in Fiji. They didn't really go the sort of extra mile to figure out what the labor rights are. This was very common, this sentiment. We give them a lot. Fijians ask for advances and take too many tea breaks. We even sometimes provide food and accommodation. There have been many occasions when people just don't show up for work. So I found that middle managers were trapped, right? They were trapped between the Fijian state and the Chinese state, but they were trapped here between this idea of projecting a good image, but also meeting their bottom line. And as this quote says, it's difficult for us to reprimand Fijians because it gives us a bad impression of Chinese when we are in their country. Okay, the fourth and last aspect of operations I want to talk about is competition. And this is fierce in the construction market in Fiji. They're competing with each other, all those railway companies, and it's cutthroat. They're competing with Australian and Aotearoa New Zealand companies. They're also competing with Fiji Chinese smaller operations too. But they had two key strategies. The first was connections. We build relationships with government officials, of course. Do you know why? It's because that's what everyone else is doing. If we want to compete with Australians and New Zealanders for contracts, we have to get cozy with the right people. So Guangxi was the first kind of approach. The second was a very, I thought, high-risk strategy, but the idea was cut costs, underbid, and then with the idea that later on down the line you can absorb those costs with further contracts. One person said, the company finishes the project for cheap, the Fijian government is happy, the people in Fiji are happy, so they want to give the company more business. But there was also resentment with Fiji Chinese, multi-generational Fiji Chinese who had small construction companies who built apartment blocks, for example. They couldn't even get a looking on those contracts either because of the kinds of resources and contacts and connections that the larger construction companies had. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. So here, right, through the lens of these middle managers, we're looking at the Chinese companies, these grounded emissaries, and finding out that it's a little bit more complex, right? Again, as Graeme was saying in the opening remarks, than just saying these are agents of Chinese state influence. We talked about how these repetitions of Chinese state development narratives were in their vernacular, but it was really premised on the bottom line, on profit. Wary of public perceptions too, that they were too closely aligned with the Chinese state was another awareness among middle managers, and that they felt constrained, right? This idea that they were constrained and vulnerable to the state, whether it was the Fijian state or the Chinese state, because of the economic relations that were being developed. But I think this last point here about importing practices, I think that many middle managers increased their own vulnerability. The sort of lack of curiosity about work culture in Fiji, the lack of curiosity about the labor rights added to negative perceptions. But also sometimes that Fijian government officials who were doing inspections on quality and standards might have been just doing their job. They might not just have been looking for a handout. Never really was something that came across many people's minds. And then this last thing about sort of upsetting local, the Fijian Chinese community that was there for multi-generations. If they couldn't get protection from the embassy, then that community has significant influence as well, where they could find protections. So just what I argue here is that through examining these grounded operations, the socially bedded emissaries, the middle managers, the guys who get overlooked, right? I think they've got a lot to tell us about contested spaces between civil, corporate and state interests. It doesn't always sort of naturally translate into broad Chinese state influence in places like Fiji. Thank you. Mahalo.
Very good morning to everyone here. I'm Trissia. I'm actually about to just take up a new position in Japan that I'm going to depart for Kyoto next month. But at the same time, I'm also a honorary postdoctoral fellow at Murdoch University in Australia. The papers that I'm about to present today actually was part of my PhD project, and right now I'm still fine-tuning and want to convert it into a single-alone journal articles. So it's called Unpacking Chinese Business-to-Business Infrastructure Financing Theme as a De-risking Strategy. And I took a case study of Jakarta-Bandung High-Speed Railway, which is the most widely celebrated project in the region, if not also one of the most controversial ones in Southeast Asia. So first, I will introduce what I'm going to talk about, which is the Chinese infrastructure financing, and explain what's the missing analytical gaps here, as well as the de-risking state. The de-risking here is different from what we have been hearing over the past few weeks, which is quite popular within the G7 meeting, de-risking China, something like that. It's different because I built the concept from the political economy scholars, from Daniela Geber, the de-risking state. It's talking about the new Washington consensus in financing infrastructure asset. And second, I will talk about the de-risking strategy through B2B that is quite peculiar in the case of Chinese infrastructure financing. Third, about the B2B cascading arrangement in Indonesia. Fourth is how about the de-risking in Indonesian state. We see the return of executive power, regulatory interventions coming from the Indonesian government to ensure that the project is investable, profitable, and also part of a safeguard mechanism for the Chinese companies as well. And fifth is about mutually reinforcing market and non-market rationales that actually form a core part of the de-risking strategies in the case of Chinese infrastructure financing. And I will conclude it by linking it with the state capitalisms and its widely impact on Chinese infrastructure financing studies in the region. Okay, so first, all of us here, needless to say, Chinese finance infrastructure deals has stock suspicions, and it's also, even though China has been raising as the key development partner for emerging countries, but they also have been widely seen as raising developmental challenges as well, like what we often heard about debt trap critics and also illicit activities, like how Chinese infrastructure financing also raise a lot of speculative activities, gambling, human trafficking, and land speculations. Especially gambling and human trafficking are quite apparent in Mekong region as well, in the Golden Triangles, and also land speculations as well that are quite commonplace in Southeast Asian countries. Like some scholars already try to portray this kind of development and try to draw some conceptual frameworks to understand how Chinese infrastructure financing or Chinese investment in general being responded by some countries. For example, there is a concept called the riskifications of Chinese investment, in which Chinese-led infrastructure financing now is rife with perceptions of, even though as yet unrealized, but potential risks. And investment controls and FDI restrictions become the central features of these riskifications. And it's commonly happening in European countries, in developed countries, including Europe, EU, and the United States as well. But actually, if we try to better understand the dynamics of Chinese infrastructure financing, not all countries are really applying the riskification of Chinese investment, even though they are aware of the risks that are embedded within the Chinese infrastructure financing. So to be fair, even Chinese infrastructure financing, the interest rate that they offer to the host government are not really low either. So it's quite high, but they still trying to accept it and deal with Chinese companies. Instead of applying investment screening to oppose or limit an investment by Chinese entities, these countries rather opt for de-risking. So they try to be optimistic, be positive about that, and de-risk Chinese large-scale investment. For example, trying to deal with the Chinese government how to have a lower interest rate, longer payment period or grace period, something like that. But on the other hand, there's also a concept called the de-risking state. In general, it means that the state actually try to absorb risk from the private sector in order to ensure that the project is investable and profitable in the longer term. So overall, in the general sense, it's more like how the state create investable assets in infrastructure, for instance, through green bonds, state guarantee, green taxonomy, and so on and so forth. Despite of that, what we have been seeing in the case of Chinese investment, actually, even though the host country tried to de-risk China, but we forgot to ask how actually China de-risked itself. Because as we have seen from the previous presentations, it seems to me that especially, for example, Chinese railway corporations, they are everywhere, and they are involving in the large-scale project, which is not cheap either. It's quite risky, but how do Chinese there is themselves actually. And how about the Chinese state and the Indonesian state? For example, here the host state are positioned in this regard. How they raise each other for ensuring that the project can proceed within the agreed term. So my argument is here that using the case study of the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway, I try to dissect the B2B, business-to-business mechanism as a preferred financing mode to de-risk such a large-scale investment. So I try to extend the de-risking state concept and try to develop it in the context of Chinese infrastructure financing, arguing that Chinese de-risking strategy involve an idiosyncratic means of managing risks, which quite differs from that are found in traditional financiers. It's not moving. Okay. Oh no. Yeah. So first of all, let me explain about the de-risking concept. So the de-risking state actually can be undertaken in various forms. So through fiscal de-risking, price guarantee, equity stake, or regulatory de-risking as well, how the state jump in and give some sort of preferential treatment for certain financing activities. This is quite apparent in infrastructure financing and widely found in Europe or in other developed countries when the state now start to act as the institutional investor like the World Bank or the ADB. They try to ensure that there is such things like technical forms of risk management that are being involved in every financing mechanisms. So it's also some sorts of modernizations of state capital hybrids and technique of modern finance. But this basic form of the de-risking state actually means the basic concepts of de-risking in the case of China. So I argue that any conception of de-risking actually has a form of ideological representations that in turn enables a professional arrangement on state's responsibility to absorb and manage the risk. So this is like how China often use an idea of using market-based official financing or business-to-business mechanisms that with the promise that they will not put state sovereignty at risk, something like that. But actually it suffers from financial and legal clarity, but after all, it's rife with ideological representation of risk management. So this is what I'm going to say is that Chinese de-risking strategy is not technocratic like what usually the World Bank or the ADB or even the developed country, the traditional financiers, Japan and the US, try to emphasize, but it's more rooted in an ideological framing of risk and risk management. And these Chinese SOE, the most important actors here, and the government use this ideological means to de-risk their large-scale investment in the developing countries with problematic debt servicing capacity already. And instead of having an ex-ante arrangement, it's much more involving cascading arrangement, like ex-post risk adjustment, in which the host state ultimately being held accountable for de-risking the project. So, but after all, it's quite different from the debt trap argument because there is some sort of Chinese free riding here on the host state financial regime capacity. It doesn't mean that the host state is the most vulnerable here, but it's like there is a specific trend where they start to free ride on the state capacity, on the state financing regime, on the host state, I mean. And also even the stakeholders, contractor and project owner, actually taking more risks, and as the Chinese government transfer some risk to these entities, and this entity will rely on the host state financing regime to save them. So I will demonstrate it using the case study of Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway. So this is the recent. So we need to congratulate China and Indonesia. Finally, after almost 8 years, the project is almost finished, and it will be entering trial period in the next August. So if you are interested in doing fieldwork in Indonesia, in Chinese infrastructure, please come to Jakarta in August. So this is the recent one. There will be 4 stations across 142 kilometers connecting Jakarta and Bandung. Halim, Karawang, Padalarang, and Tegaluar. But actually, the project itself has met resistance among civil society and politicians when it was started in 2015, apart from the fact that Japan lost to China in this regard. But amidst the growing criticisms, the Indonesian government held the view that the project served as a turnkey component of contemporary development policy, which encompass mobile solutions to address a range of issues. It's just like typical governmentality, like job creations, local connectivity, growth, etc., etc. But this is the consortium. This is the first arrangement. It's not the updated one. The updated one I will show you later, but this is the first one. The first one is, this has happened in 2015, 2016, when there are 4 Indonesian SOEs set up a consortium, as well as Chinese companies as well. And the WIKA, the Wijaya Karya Construction Company, is supposed to be the lead company in these consortiums. And together they made up a joint venture with 60% owned by Indonesian side, 40% owned by Indonesian side. But actually, to be honest, when they are about to make these consortiums, these Indonesian companies are under financial distress. So even though the construction costs as well as liabilities, for example, the existing higher debt to equity ratio are quite high, especially in the case of Indonesian companies. But after all, there is some sort of ideological representation of risk here, in the sense that this company and the way the government calculate the risk itself, are much guided by common cost-benefit analysis, that the return on investment will exceed the total cost, just like that, just simple as that. And it's also accompanied by the tendency of Chinese policy banks that tend to assess the project by looking at the potential creditworthiness of the profitability that the project will generate in the future, instead of looking at the trustworthiness and the creditworthiness of the companies involved. So it's quite ridiculous actually, because at the time the assessment that they made is much more about the comparison between Jakarta, Bandung, and Beijing, Tianjin high-speed railway, that they assumes that the profitability generate through the Beijing, Tianjin will be replicated through this Jakarta, Bandung high-speed railway, which is actually 2 different cases. But this is what I mean by the representations, ideological representations of risk management. Oh my goodness, 1 minute. Yeah, so it's represented as the financing deal, and this is what I mean by the credit rate. They are not healthy at all, even until now, and risk assessment was just readily seen as complete. But at the end, the de-risking intervention here is that how the Chinese state apparently, they try to push the Indonesian government to de-risk the project, and there are some sorts of the ownership changes here, as well as the regulatory authorities. So that 3 ministries on the left-hand side, they are actually not being involved in the first arrangement. The first arrangement just promote about the B2B that are involving SOEs, but now all these 3 ministries, which is quite powerful ministry in Indonesia, are jumping into the project and take all the de-risking interventions here, including making this project as widely deemed national strategic project, meaning that this project now owned by the governments, and all different levels of governments must ensure that the project must succeed whatever the cost takes. And then also there is the introductions and the implementation of law number 2 of 2012 here about the land acquisition, because actually this law is actually can be enforceable in terms of SOE-led project in Indonesia, or the government project in Indonesia which use state budget. But at the end, this law is implemented in the case of Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway, as well as the state capital injection. So after all, the Indonesian government roll out and inject the capital through through the Kereta Api Indonesia. On the right-hand side, you can see there is a development here about the ownership changes because the Kereta Api Indonesia now become the lead of the joint venture, but the 30% of the equity requirements that the Kereta Api Indonesia paid to the Chinese Development Bank, actually the capitals come from the Indonesian state budget. So this is what we see as the non-market rationals from the Indonesian side. But from the Chinese side, interestingly, they're still trying hard to push the market rationals, try to push the Indonesian government to agree on the debt extensions like what they usually did for their local economy, and also to save their policy banks, because their policy banks are also relying on the market itself. So this is what I said about the mutually reinforcing market and non-market rationals. Yeah. So if we see here, the China 1.0 is actually the ones that they made, the arrangement they made when they bid the project from the get-go, which is in 2015. But now China 2.0 that's what exactly happening now. So the Indonesian government positions, they have to inject more capital to their own SOEs. They need to save their own SOE that actually indirectly also save the Chinese government and the policy bank. And also the financing scheme from the B2B deal right now is lack of clarity, and I think the lack of clarity is just like the core part of Chinese de-risking strategy. And there is a lot of development here, and also suddenly there are the change in interest rate as well, and the road from 8 stations to 4 stations completely changed. And the ticket price and the time frame actually is until now there is lack of clarity as well. They just say it's trial, but they don't say that it's really operating in a given period of time. So it's completely different from Japan side, which is like the Japan side already de-risked it from the very beginning. They just exercise what the real de-risking state should be happening. So they have some sort of ex-ante arrangement, like there is exactly government loan that is needed to transfer the risk or absorb the risk if the SOE need to be involved in the project, and also the interest quite low, which is 0.1%. Yeah, so I will conclude here. It's really grumpy. Yeah, okay. So this 1, 2, 3. So the Chinese infrastructure financing here actually broaden the debate about Chinese infrastructure investment, because what I try to argue here is not challenging the concept itself about the de-risking state, but adding more nuances to the de-risking concept that was introduced by Daniela Gauber. And also the second part is that the B2B actually is quite embedded with what state capitalisms nowadays that are being widely discussed among political economy scholars such as Wall Street Consensus, etc., etc. And actually, what Chinese case is adding to the New Washington Consensus is that there are some sort of ideological works that are attached to the B2B that actually re-legitimate the de-risking interventions. And number 3 is that the free riding mechanisms that have not yet been examined by Chinese scholars studying infrastructure financing in Southeast Asia, how Chinese companies are actually, and even policy banks, are actually free riding on some financing regime that are being introduced in the host countries. I will just stop here and open to any discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Trissia, and that's the 3 presentations, and now we're going to have Graeme to give his discussion thing, whatever.
Discussing.
And I don't think Graeme needs an introduction because Graeme already introduced him earlier, so we'll just go straight on to Greg's discussants.
Good. Yes, I'll keep it very brief. I've got 5 minutes, and you obviously all have lots of questions, so I'll just keep my remarks very, very brief. Sanoop, I used to be a chemist, and one of my colleagues on a particularly dark day wrote on the whiteboard, no ideas plus no results equals big problems. You don't have that problem. You have so many ideas and so much data that your problem is the reverse. You have to find a way to narrow it down, looking at what your strongest data is, and go back and really find what your question is, because I wasn't seeing a question coming out there. It was because this is, I guess ultimately it depends what you want to do with the paper, but assuming you're looking to publish in the China Journal, you need to have a really clear question up front there. And it was a bit more like a report, which in Canberra we love reports. We're used to reports, and it's a mode of writing we're very comfortable with, but it won't go into a journal in that form. So looking through, I mean, having not read your paper, and I look forward to reading it if you could send it to me afterwards. It's a case of looking at which of those things you can get at, and it really depends on where your strongest data is. But I mean, my ideas were perhaps a comparative focus on strategies, so comparing what sort of strategies these different companies employ. In terms of, you had a really interesting idea of that you got to a bit late, I think, talking about the evolving agency within the countries. And I think that's really interesting because you've got several countries with similar-ish systems. Of course, they change over time. The Maldives has had quite a large shift recently. And obviously the other countries, depending on the political leadership, will have quite different shifts in their attitude to Chinese investment. But again, that either looking at the different approaches of the different companies. I mean, it's fascinating. You have a company called the Zhaoshangju Gangkou. It's like, I had no idea the Zhaoshangju were had their own company, and that was at the heart of this this project. So yeah, either of those two approaches, but really depends where your strongest data is. Henrik, always tricky to comment on your stuff because I know it so well, but really interesting as always to read quotes from these middle managers whose voices are always silent in these things. And like yourself, I spend a lot of time trying to track these guys down. And they often are very direct and very funny. One thing I was wondering in terms of labour, particularly in this relationship, not just with it's an aspect that didn't come out in your talk, but I'm wondering if it's there in your paper, the relationship of these middle managers to the Chinese staff and the difficulty, and this is something I've come across on a few projects, of accessing quality Chinese staff to do the construction work, in that there's a great paper written a few years ago by a guy at Oxford University. I'm forgetting his name at the moment. Xiaobang or Bang Xiao or something like that. But essentially he had a really interesting paper about windows and the difficulty of accessing labour within rural China, and that you had to go through an increasing number of middlemen to get them. And so labour was becoming both lower quality, just because of the demographic shifts in China, and also more expensive, because at each stage of the process of finding the labour, you were having to pay 10% or whatever it might be to reach further into rural China to get your labour. The other thing, and this might have been specific to my project in Papua New Guinea, is if anything united the local staff and the Chinese staff, it was their mutual hatred of middle managers. Like, it may be that in a mining project it's a bit different because the mining project's so much bigger and you have a much more complex corporate structure, whereas possibly in building a road or building a building, your hierarchies are a bit flatter, so that might not arise. But I was curious about that, whether you talked to staff and got their idea of what these middle managers were like. Because obviously people want to present themselves in the best light, but they may be the problem, which you kind of hinted at a bit with their adaptation to labour practices in Fiji. And on that, and this might be hard to have a comparative angle, but I wonder if the company's experience vary depending on where the project is in Fiji, because the kind of things that are drawing labour away from the construction site, such as traditional obligations, funerals, weddings, all kinds of things, are much stronger in rural Fiji than they would be in, say, Suva. So whether there's any data on how that differs for the companies, because some company like China Railway First, they have so many projects, they would have that comparative angle. And finally, Trissia, what a really interesting approach, and I think possibly the best question of the conference so far. How does China de-risk itself? I thought that was just a great question. That could almost be the title of your paper. And what, I guess the question of why and what would make the Chinese state de-risk itself, particularly in such a complex arrangement. I mean, you had 5 different companies there working together. And one of my first questions on seeing that org chart was, surely there's a huge amount of effort to shift the risk between those 5 companies. Like, they're all big players. They all know how the game works within the Chinese bureaucratic system. To what extent are they, shall we say, having a bit of a party with soft budget constraints and really trying to maximise their own advantage relative not just to the Indonesian players but also to their Chinese, often Chinese competitors, I think you would call them. So they're working together, but certainly I don't think they would necessarily be friendly. This concept of cascading arrangement, I love that as a concept. And debt extension is something we see throughout the Pacific. The idea that, well, no, we're not going to forgive it, but we're happy to kick the can down the road, which is something that is very much a feature of the Chinese domestic landscape, and leads to, in this case, it's a project that's $1.2 billion over budget. But if you look at the Chinese economy and how much debt is built into these local government financing vehicles, you're looking at a much larger figure. So I loved your comparison of domestic approaches to debt and how that almost has been exported. So rather than it being a debt trap, it's sort of almost debt comfort within the Chinese system that is being exported. Another question that occurred to me is about the asymmetry of actors. The sort of de-risking that you're talking about might not be as possible in smaller markets. So in the Pacific, for example, a state actor like Tonga doesn't have the same leverage as the Indonesian state. And I think that's a really interesting thing for you to unpack. Obviously, you don't need to have the data yourself, but comparing it to similar experiences with China Development Bank projects in other smaller countries or even larger countries where the host state might have more leverage, I think would strengthen the paper. But like I said, with all 3, I haven't seen your papers, and I really look forward to seeing them. So I'll throw it open to you guys. I'm sure you have many questions. Thanks so much, guys. That was great.